Next speaker is Tammy Solonec. Tammy's a Nigger woman from Derby in the Kimberley, mother of two. Tammy is currently Indigenous Rights Manager at Amnesty International Australia and a member of the WA Lawyers Committee. So please welcome her up.
The current threat of closures to remote Indigenous communities in Western Australia has come about after the federal government announced in September last year that they had reached what they called historic agreements with the states, which would see the end of Commonwealth funding and coordination for municipal and essential services in remote Indigenous communities from July this year. This includes essential services like power and water and services local government supplies in ordinary towns like roads, parks and water and rubbish collection. This is a service that the Commonwealth Government have been providing for 50 years. They started funding these services using their newly obtained powers that they obtained after the 1967 referendum to legislate for Aboriginal people. They did so to meet Australia's international human rights obligations, and as a result of the 1970s outstation movement, which sought to rectify the poor execution of the basic wage in 1968 when thousands of Aboriginal people were moved from their homelands. The catastrophic result of this is still being felt by Aboriginal people today. We cannot repeat this past. No way. The Western Australian government accepted a $90 million once-off payment from the federal government to start taking over these services. But then they proceeded to say that they couldn't afford to do that and they'd have to close up to 150 remote Indigenous communities. Shame. This negotiation was done without the free, prior informed consent of those communities. This shame. And we don't even know if this money has been quarantined. The South Australian Government, with the assistance of their Aboriginal Lands Trust, did not accept the Commonwealth terms so freely. They rejected the initial offer of $10 million and renegotiated with the federal government for $15 million, plus for the federal government to take responsibility of the APY lands. Then, just this week, we see that the federal government have announced that they're cutting funds to the APY lands. Despite this, the involvement of the South Australian Aboriginal Lands Trust in negotiating a better deal for their people was positive. It's essential that we as Aboriginal people are involved in decisions that affect us. We must demand that this talking about us without us stops. We know that living in remote communities is hardly a lifestyle choice, that our people have a custodianship and a deep spiritual connection with their land. Moving Aboriginal people from their homelands will be harder than making those communities viable and sustainable. It'll cause intergenerational trauma. It'll break connections with land and culture. It'll force people to move into larger towns and cities who are already experiencing overcrowding and where they'll have greater exposure to drugs, alcohol, violence and ultimately incarceration. We see before the WA Parliament at this moment a bill that has already passed the lower house to impose mandatory sentencing for home burglaries, including for children and for people with mental health conditions. We know that if this bill passes, we know that if this bill passes, more of our men, women and children will end up in prison. We know that if remote communities are closed, that it'll make this situation even worse. So we've got a petition and we ask that you sign it. At Amnesty, we worked extensively for Indigenous peoples, including we ran a whole campaign in the Northern Territory to ensure that they had essential and municipal services. Last year, we campaigned to stop the demolition of Ungulgurri. Despite our campaign, and against the wishes of the affected residents and the Kimberley Land Council, last year they did demolish that town. Shame. The WA government tried to justify the demolition of over $30 million worth of housing and infrastructure by labelling the community unviable and dysfunctional. We know that this is the oldest excuse in the book to deny the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. We saw it with the stolen generations, we saw it with the Northern Territory intervention, we saw it with ATSIC, we saw it with the Community Housing Infrastructure Program, we saw it with the Community Development Employment Project. We don't buy this excuse anymore, it has to stop. In November last year, we issued a press release urging the West Australian Government not to forcibly evict any more homelands communities, not to demolish any more communities, because it breaches international law. This includes the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 8 of the Declaration states that Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to not be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. And Article 10 of the Declaration says that Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. Australia has signed up to all these agreements and must be held to account. The West Australian Government cannot forcibly evict any more Aboriginal people from their homes, and if they do, with communities like Yulwulgari, they must be compensated for their loss and be able to go back to their homelands. So in closing, I just want to thank you again all for coming. I want to really acknowledge that this is an Indigenous-led process. SOS Black Australia is led by Kimberley women, and I'm proud to be a Kimberley woman. And to all the governments and the media and everyone out there listening, please listen to our voices. Please learn from the past. Please ensure that you comply with the international rights that you owe to all as citizens. Thank you.